The coastal town of Harborview wore September like a faded shawl. The summer crowds had long since vanished, leaving behind only traces salt-tinged laughter on the breeze. Forgotten sandals on porches, echoes caught between the weathered shingles of old beach houses. Margaret Thorne stood at her kitchen window, watching the golden afternoon lights spill across the wooden deck of the home she'd shared with Henry for 36 years. It was still a beautiful house, and she, perhaps, still a beautiful woman, though she rarely thought of herself that way anymore. Time had left its gentle marks. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, silver threading through her once rich chestnut hair. But her eyes remained clear, watchful, wanting upstairs. Henry's voice murmured distantly through the ceiling, rising and falling like a tide. Another conference call? Another client? Retirement had never truly untethered him. 3 years into their so-called second act, and he was still hooked into his old firm like a marionette pulled by strings of habit, duty, and perhaps a fear of stillness. Margaret slipped her bare feet into her garden shoes and stepped outside. The late sun touched her shoulders with familiar warmth as she followed the stone path to her flower beds. Gardening had become her solace here, her hands digging where they could not touch the growing distance between herself and Henry. It had been years since he had touched her with anything resembling hunger. Years of polite kisses, of dutiful, infrequent lovemaking that left her feeling lonelier than no touch at all. Her body, once worshipped, had become invisible. First to him, then, gradually, to herself. "Those dahlias are putting on quite a show," a voice said, cutting through the quiet. Startled, she turned. James Ellis stood at the low stone wall that divided their properties. A widower of 5 years, once a literature professor, he carried the quiet elegance of someone who had walked through grief without letting it sour him. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and his eyes were the color of sea glass, soft, worn, and steady. "They've decided autumn is their time," Margaret said, offering a smile that felt unusually warm on her lips. "I wasn't expecting such a bloom so late." James smiled. "The most beautiful things often arrive when we've stopped looking for them." His gaze moved from her eyes to her lips, and lower still, lingering on the soft outline of her body beneath her worn gardening shirt. Something stirred in her then, a spark long dormant. His look didn't feel invasive. It felt reverent. She felt seen that evening. As she prepared dinner, alone, Henry locked away in his study, Margaret found her thoughts drifting back to that gaze. The way James had looked at her, not like a woman past her prime, but like one still radiant, desirable. She caught her reflection in the kitchen window and, for the first time in years, looked at herself not with critique, but curiosity. Maybe even longing. The following Thursday, she ran into James at the local bookstore. He cradled an armful of poetry collections. "My guilty pleasure," he said with a sheepish grin. "At my age, I should probably be reading about estate planning or supplements for joint pain." "And deprive the world of another romantic soul," she teased. "That would be criminal." They shared coffee at the cafe tucked in the back of the shop. He recommended Wallace Stevens. She spoke of her fondness for Mary Oliver. The conversation flowed like water, finding its natural course. When his knee brushed hers under the table, she didn't move away. The contact was small, but it lit something electric in her skin. "I find myself thinking about you," James said quietly, his gaze locking onto hers. "More than is probably wise." Margaret's breath caught. "I've been thinking about you too," she admitted. His hand brushed hers across the table. "We're not naive," he said. "We know what this could become." "Yes," she whispered. "We do." Rain pattered against the windows, soft and rhythmic as they sat there. Fingers intertwined, poised on the edge of something terrifying and exhilarating. Their encounters continued Thursdays at the cafe, incidental meetings at the grocery store, lingering conversations at the mailbox. Margaret began dressing with more care, resurrecting silk blouses, dusting off old perfumes. Henry, still distracted, By the perpetual buzz of his professional world, barely noticed the change. One stormy Thursday in mid-October, the rain came down in heavy sheets as they stood by the window in the cafe. "My house is just down the street," James said, watching the downpour. "We could wait out the storm there. I've just opened a bottle of Cabernet that deserves company." The invitation hung in the air transparent. Tempting. Margaret thought of Henry. Thought of the silence between them, the empty bed, the forgotten tenderness. She thought of her own reflection, how it had started to look alive again. "I'd like that," she said, her voice calm, though her heart thudded with anticipation. James's home was much like him. Warm, thoughtful, unpretentious. Books lined every wall. The furniture was worn but inviting. He poured the wine, his fingers brushing hers. "Two unexpected pleasures," he said, eyes never leaving hers. They talked. About poems, about places they had never visited, about lives lived and unlived. The distance between them shrank until conversation gave way to touch. His hand cupped her cheek and she leaned into it like sunlight. "I want you, Margaret," he said. "I've wanted you since the day I saw you in your garden. But I won't move forward unless you want this too." "I do," she whispered, the truth of it shivering through her. "I want to feel alive again. I want to be touched like I matter." His kiss was soft at first, then deeper, full of longing neither had voiced. Her body answered with an urgency that surprised her, fierce and molten. When his hand slid beneath her blouse, exploring skin long forgotten, she gasped not in fear, but in reawakening. "We can stop," he murmured against her throat. "We don't have to," she breathed. "Don't stop," she interrupted, pulling him closer. "Please don't stop." They Medelavi on his sofa, too impatient to fend. Bedroom, he undressed her slowly, high size, darkening with appreciation as each piece of clothing fell away when she moved to cover the softness of her stomach, the silvery stretch marks from pregnancies, decades past. He gently pulled her hands away. "Let me see you," he said, "all of you. You're magnificent." He worshipped her body with his hands, and both finding places of pleasure she'd forgotten existed. Margaret's surrenderetto sensation. Her back arching as his thong traced patterns across her breasts, her stomach between her thighs. One he finally entered. Her she cried out in raw pleasure, her nails digging ginto, his shoulders beautiful, he whispered. Against her ear, his movements low and deliberate, so beautiful afford lying tangled together beneath a throw blanket, the rain still drumming against the windows. Margaret felt simultaneously ancient and newborn. "Never thought I'd feel this way again," she confessed, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I thought this part of me hated with youth." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, where taught that passion belongs to the young, as thought desire has an expiration date. Anotherly society tells us about aging in 3 weeks that followed. Margaret lived a double life. Mornings with Henry, sharing breakfast and companionable. Silence, discussing practical matters of bill payments and home repairs. Afternoons with James, their bodies and minds intertwined with increasing familiarity and deepening need. She discovered a hunger in herself she'd thought long extinguished sometimes. They barely medit through the door before tearing at each other's clothes, taking each a thir against walls or on kitchen counters long. At their own urgency, other times they spent hours in his bed, exploring each other's bodies with deliberate slowness. Finding all thepluses that made the other moan or gasp or beg, he taught her to ask for what she wanted, to voice desires she'd kept silent for decades in turn. She learned that geography of his body, the surgical scar on his lower back, the constellation off, freckles on his shoulder, the way he groaned when she took him in her mouth, sensitive spot at the base of his neck that made him shudder when she pressed her lips. "There, you've awakened something in me," she told him one afternoon as they lay spent. Angel listening with sweat in his rumpled bed. "Something I thought was gone forever. It was never gone." He set his fingers tracing lazy circles on her hip. "Just dormant, waiting for the right touch. The guilt came later." arriving not during their passionate encounters but in quiet moments at home watching Henry doze in his armchair. His reading glasses lighting down his nose, she felt through of her deception like a stone in her stomach. He had been a good husband, faithful. If distant, he had provided protected parenthood alongside her. Did 36 years of marriage mean nothing? Not age. The intoxication of new disarray seemed. Differenthenry remarked one evening as they prepared for bed happier. Somehow the observation delivered with mild curiosity rather than suspicion. Pierce adore heart do I, it suits you, he said, offering a smile. That reminded her of earlier years. He kissed her forehead bare, turning out the light, a chase hushed her, that now felt like an indictment that night she lay awake beside her sleeping husband. Wondering when they had stopped reaching for each other in the darkness, when had comfort replaced passion? When had they accepted the slow death of desire as an inevitable sex? Long marriage, the African teened through autumn leaves falling from trees in brilliant surrender as Margaret fell deeper into her relationship with James. They found secret places to meet his house, when then a boring cottages were empty, hidden corners of the beach on weekday mornings, since even a hotel. 2 towns over, where Ethy spent a glorious afternoon making love and reading poetry, a lab between passionate encounters. It was in this hall, watching sunset paint the walls with amber light, that James first spoke of a future we could have more than stolen. Ours, he said, his finger tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. We could have mornings and evenings, every day. The implication hung in the air between them. You're asking me to leave, Henry, she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake. Amen. Her chest, I'm asking you to choose happiness, your happiness, at the cost of destroying someone who has given him a lifetime. James didn't argue. He understood the complexity, the history that bound her to a marriage that had lost its fire but not its foundation. I would never pressure you, he said finally. I just want you to know that my door is open. If you ever walk through it'll be waiting. The following week brought the first real crisis. Margaret rattled home from meeting James to find Henry sitting at the kitchen table. His boss, Ashen Caroline, called. He sat referring to their neighbor. She thought Is should know she saw you entering James Liss's house last Tuesday and leaving several hours later. The floor seemed top shift beneath Margaret's feet. Henry, she mentioned, it's not the first time. His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled as they rested on the table. Is there something I should know? The question hung in the air, offering her a choice lie or shatter the life they built. Together, Margaret sank into the chair opposite him, her legs suddenly enameled to support her weight. Yes, she said simply, there is. What followed was the most honest conversation they'd had in decades. Margaret spoke of loneliness within their marriage, of feeling invisible as she aged, of the joy shed found in being desired again, oft physical hunger that had reawakened in her after years of dormancy. Was the last time you realized me, Henry, not out of habit or obligation, but because you wanted me one, was the last time you looked at me, buddy, with desire instead of familiar author questions hung in the air between them, painful in their accuracy. Henry listened, his face a mask of pain and bewilderment. I never stopped loving you, said when she finished. I just forgot to show it. When did we stop seeing each other, Margaret? When did we become strangers sharing a house? I don't know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'd happened so gradually, I barely noticed. Until the distance became an ocean. That night, Henry slept in Thega's room. Margaret lay awake in their bed, the sheets cold beside her, weighing what she had done against what she had gained. The next morning, Henry Annan said was going to stay with their son in Boston. For a while, I need time to think, said his suitcase already packed by his door, and so do you after. He left. The house echoed with his absence. Margaret moved through rooms that suddenly seemed too large to empty. She didn't contact James. This was a reckoning. She needed to face alone 3 days into Henry's absence. Margaret woke to the sound of someone at the door. She opened it to find James standing on her porch, concern etched into his features. I heard Henry left town, he said. Are you all right? She didn't invite him in. He knows about us, James. Nodded, unsurprised, small town shave, big eyes. I need time. James isn't just about us. It's about 36 years of my life. It's about vows. I made her reached for her hand, but she kept it at her side. I understand, he said. Thaddeus appointed shadowed. His eyes, I'll be here when you're ready to talk. The week sat. Followed with the loneliest of Margaret's life. Henry remained in Boston, their phone conversations brief and laden with unspoken pain. James respected a request for space. Thought occasionally she would find evidence of Fist's thoughts, a book of poetry. In her mailbox, fresh stirs on her porch, swing winter descended on Harbor View, bringing with it bitter winds and early darkness. Margaret found herself standing at windows, watching snowfall onto an empty garden, wondering how she had arrived at this desolate crossroads one evening. A particularly fierce storm battered the coast. The power went out. Margaret lit candles and wrapped herself in a blanket, listening to the wind howl around thieves of the empty house, when a knock came at her door. She half expected to find James, but it was Henry who stood on threshold, snowflakes melting in his gray hair. May I come in? He asked, his voice nearly lost in the wind. They sat before the fireplace, mugs of tea warming, their hands silent, stretching between them. Like the winter night outside, Eve been seeing a therapist in Boston. Henry finally said, trying to understand what happened to us, not just this off-air, but the years before it, how we'd drifted so far apart without noticing. Margaret nodded, tears threatening. Ivy been asking myself the same questions. Do you love him? Henry asked the question direct, but not accusatory. She considered leaving, then discarded the thought. They had had enough dishonesties, but differently than I've loved you. It's new and exciting, but it doesn't thave the roots our love has. It doesn't thave history. Do you want to be with him? Don't know, she admitted. Some days I think I do. Other days I miss what we had, what we could have again. If we treat. Henry set down his mug and reached for her hand. I don't want to lose you, Margaret, but I don't want to keep you if staying makes you unhappy. He took a deep breath. I want to touch you again, realitic you. I want to learn your bod you gain. If you'll let me. The fire crackled in the great shadows, dancing across their joined hands. I'd like to try. Again, Henry said not to continue, as we wear boat to rediscover each other, to find out if there's still something worth fighting for. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. What if we try and fail? What if we can't find our way back? Then at least we'll know we tried. He squeezed her hand. I'm not asking for promises. Time to see if we can build something new from the ashes of what burned out that night for the first time in years. Henry looked at her naked body with real hunger in his eyes. His hands, tentative at first, then more confidential, lured the curves and hollows of her form. Margaret closed her eyes and surrendered to his touch, surprised to find desire rising within her, different from what she felt with James, but Knowles's real show. Me, Henry whispered against her skin. Show me what you like, what you need. And she did, guiding Hishans's mouth, finding a new language of intimacy between them, honest in a way they had never been before. When they finally came together, it was with her thought took them both by surprise, leaving them breathless and wondering at what had been dormant, but not dead, between them. The next morning, Margaret walked to James's house, her footprints leaving a solitary trail in the fresh snow he upon the door before. She could knock us, though he'd been waiting. Henry came home last night, she said, pain flashed across James's face, quickly masked. I see we've decided to try again, to see we can rebuild what we've lost. He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. I always knew this was a possibility. You gave me thing. Precious James, you helped. Mara, remember him, still alive, still a woman with desires and needs, still capable of passion and joy. I'll never forget that gift. But you're choosing him. He said, his voice gentle despite the hurt evident in his eyes. I'm choosing to hone her 40 years before I walk away from them. I need to know if there's anything left to save. James stepped forward, gathering her into his arms one last time. She breathed In his familiar scent books and cedar and coffee, memorizing itif. It doesn't work, he whispered against their hair. If you find you can't rebuild wits, broken my door will still be open. Stepped back, her hands lingering on his chest before falling. Away goodbye James Spring came to Harborview with its promise of renewal. Margaret planted her garden with Henry working. Beside her, their hands occasionally brushing in Thedric soil, they attended Mary Jeckensilling in the neighboring town learning. To speak truths, long buried Tolleson with new ears some days wear harder than others. There were arguments that opened old wounds, silences thought threatened to become permanent, but there were also discoveries. Henry's unexpected land for baking bread. Margaret Treadester, love of painting, they'd touched each other with growing confidence. Relearning the language of desire that had been forgotten but not lost one evening in late May. As they walked along the beach at sunset, Henry took her hand. I saw James at the market yesterday. Margaret tensed. A weddict for a while? He seems like a good man. He is, she said carefully. Henry stopped walking, turning to face her. I'm not blind. Margaret, I see how summit time is your eyes look for him when we're in town. I know there will always be a part of you that wonders what if she started to protest. But he gently placed a finger on her lips. It's all right. We all carry might have beans. He cupped her face in his hands. But I want you to know that I see you now, all of you, and I choose you every day, not out of habit or history, but because the woman you are today still takes my breath away. That night, as Henry slept beside her, Margaret gazed out at the star-filled sky visible through their bedroom window. She thought of James, hoping he would find someone to share his poetry and passion. She thought of the woman she had been before, invisible, fading, resigned to emotional hibernation. And she thought of the woman she was becoming, awake, seen choosing her life rather than simply living it outside the tide pulled at the shore. In its ancient rhythm of departure and return, Margaret closed her eyes and listened to Henry's breathing, beside her, understanding at last that love wasn't just passion or comfort, but the daily choice to see and be seen, to leave and return, to forgive and begin again. In theaterness she reached for her husband's hand and found it already reaching for hers. Thanks for listening.